The Rivers family lived in a two-story brick home on the nicest street in town. Perfectly trimmed hedges lined the walkway, and colorful flowers bloomed under the windows. Neighbors often slowed down as they passed, admiring the house and the family inside it. Dr. Matthew Rivers was a well-known psychologist, often seen giving interviews on local TV about parenting and mental health. His twin children, Ethan and Emily, were the pride of the community. Both were good-looking, smart, and charismatic, involved in every school event, from theater to sports. They wore expensive clothes, drove brand-new cars, and hosted the most talked-about parties. To outsiders, they were everything a family should be: successful, polished, and close-knit. When Matthew announced that he was opening his home to a foster child, people only admired him more. It was seen as another generous act by a man who seemed to have endless compassion. The foster child was a 15-year-old girl named Sophie. She was quiet and serious, with long brown hair and wary eyes. Sophie had bounced from one foster home to another for years. She had learned to pack light, speak softly, and never get too comfortable. Still, when she first arrived at the Rivers house, she allowed herself a little hope. Everything about the house seemed welcoming at first. The warm lights, the smell of fresh bread from the kitchen, and the polite smiles from Ethan and Emily. Matthew gave Sophie a beautifully decorated room upstairs, complete with a queen-sized bed and her own bathroom. There were even welcome gifts on her dresser: a new backpack for school, a small silver necklace, and a diary with a pen. Sophie clutched the diary tightly that first night, feeling for the first time in a long time that maybe, just maybe, she had found a place to stay for good. The next morning, Matthew introduced Sophie to the neighbors at a small gathering in their backyard. Everyone clapped and smiled, telling Sophie how lucky she was to join such a wonderful family. Sophie smiled back, not because she truly felt lucky, but because she had learned that smiling was safer than showing fear. For a few days, everything seemed normal. The twins were friendly enough, offering to drive her to school and helping her find her classes. Matthew checked on her each evening, asking how her day had been and giving her advice on fitting in. Sophie tried her best to follow every rule, to be polite, to stay out of the way. She couldn't afford to lose another home. But underneath the surface, something felt wrong. It was little things at first. A glance between Ethan and Emily when Sophie spoke. The way Matthew's smile never quite reached his eyes. Sophie tried to brush it off as her own nerves. After all, everyone said the Rivers family was perfect. She told herself she was just being paranoid. But deep inside, a cold feeling began to grow, a feeling she knew all too well. Something wasn't right here. She didn't know it yet, but the polished, beautiful house was hiding secrets darker than anything she had ever faced before. Sophie was about to learn that not all monsters hide in the dark. Some live in the brightest, most beautiful places, wearing the warmest smiles. At first, Sophie tried to push aside the growing unease she felt about her new life. She told herself it was just nerves. After all, being in a new place, with new people, always took time to adjust. But soon the cracks in the Rivers family's perfect facade began to show. Ethan and Emily, despite their outward friendliness, began to treat her differently. At first it was small things, tiny jabs that Sophie could easily dismiss. They would comment on her clothes, saying she didn't have the right brand of shoes, or make a sly remark about her messy hair. Sophie brushed it off, telling herself they were just teasing. And after all, they were so popular and confident that maybe it was her who was just being overly sensitive. But as the days went by, the teasing turned into something darker. Ethan started to manipulate her into doing things she wasn't comfortable with. He would ask her to carry his books or do his chores when Matthew wasn't around. Emily, on the other hand, would give Sophie a smile that felt like a warning before making her clean up after the twins' messes. Sophie couldn't quite place why, but she always felt like they were testing her, pushing her to see how far they could go before she would snap. It wasn't long before they started setting her up for small humiliations. One afternoon, Emily invited Sophie to join her and some of her friends at the local mall. It seemed harmless enough, and Sophie was excited to finally make a real connection. But when they arrived, the twins and their friends began to ignore her, leaving Sophie to wander around the mall alone. When she finally returned home, red-faced and embarrassed, Emily pretended to have no idea what happened. "Oh, you should have just come with us," she said nonchalantly. "But I guess you just couldn't keep up." It wasn't just the words, though. It was the way they looked at her. Their eyes, cold and calculating, made Sophie feel as if she were being judged, analyzed like some science experiment. And worse, Sophie began to notice Matthew's strange indifference. He was there, of course, but whenever she tried to bring up the twins' behavior, he dismissed it with a wave. "You just need to get along," he'd say. "They're just kids. They'll come around." The more Sophie tried to make sense of it, the more she realized that no one would ever believe. Her schoolwork started to suffer. Ethan and Emily would deliberately ruin her homework, erasing her notes or stealing her papers and handing them back in pieces. Sophie's grades dropped, and soon she was called into a meeting with her guidance counselor. The counselor expressed concern over her sudden drop in performance and asked if she was okay. Sophie, not wanting to make waves, gave a vague answer. Nothing was wrong. She was just adjusting to the new school. But deep inside, Sophie knew something had shifted. The twins were playing games with her, and each time they succeeded in making her feel small, they grew bolder, more confident. It was then that Sophie realized the truth. They weren't just playing pranks or teasing her. They were deliberately trying to break her. They wanted to see how far they could push her before she cracked. What they didn't know was that Sophie had been broken before, over and over again, by people who promised her safety and love, only to take it away when she least expected it. The Rivers family was no different. She had learned to survive in chaos, but this was a different kind of battle, one she wasn't sure she could win. She spent more time locked in her room, trying to escape the tension of the house. But the walls of her new home were closing in around her. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that somehow, in ways she couldn't explain, Matthew was complicit in it all. The house that had once seemed so welcoming now felt like a cage, and Sophie was trapped inside, slowly losing hope. As the days turned into weeks, Sophie began to notice the subtle but terrifying shift in the atmosphere around her. It wasn't just the constant bullying from Ethan and Emily that weighed her down. It was the chilling realization that Matthew, the man who was supposed to be her protector, was not only aware of the abuse but actively encouraged it. Sophie had always thought that a father's role was to shield his children from harm, to be the voice of reason when things went wrong. But in the Rivers house, it was becoming clear that Matthew was far from the father figure she had imagined. Instead, he was an observer, one who seemed detached from his children's cruelty, yet strangely supportive of it. Every time Sophie tried to confide in him, Matthew would give her the same response. "They're just having fun. They don't mean anything by it." His voice would be calm, almost soothing, but there was something in his eyes that made Sophie shudder. It wasn't the compassion she expected. It was a coldness that sent chills down her spine. He never raised his voice. He never showed anger. Instead, he acted as though Sophie were the problem, as if she were too sensitive or unable to handle the twins' behavior. He would make her feel guilty for even bringing it up, convincing her that she was overreacting. The isolation Sophie felt grew with each passing day. Ethan and Emily would no longer even try to hide their hostility. They'd deliberately push her out of conversations, whisper behind her back, and laugh at her discomfort. Sophie no longer tried to make friends at school. She kept her head down, doing whatever she could to avoid being noticed. The once bustling house now felt empty, suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in on her. Then, the cruelty began to escalate. It started with Emily inviting Sophie to help her with a school project. Sophie thought it might be an opportunity to bond, but instead it became a trap. Emily had spent hours preparing for the project, but when Sophie arrived to help, she found the entire project already completed, the work designed to make Sophie feel useless. They taunted her for not being good enough, for always needing to be helped. Emily and Ethan would laugh, as though the humiliation was part of some twisted game, and Sophie, feeling too small to protest, would retreat to her room, her heart pounding with shame. It wasn't just the emotional torment that Sophie had to endure anymore. It was physical, too. At first, it had been the occasional shove or prank, but now the twins were getting more violent. Sophie was slapped when she accidentally knocked over a glass, and on another occasion, Ethan shoved her into the stairs, causing her to fall and twist her ankle. When Sophie went to Matthew for help, all he did was give her a cold stare and tell her, "They're just kids, they'll get over it." He never intervened. He never raised his voice, never showed concern. To him, it seemed as if Sophie were the one causing trouble, that she was somehow deserving of this treatment. What terrified Sophie the most wasn't the physical pain. It was the feeling of being utterly alone. The people she was supposed to trust were the ones causing her harm, and there was no one to turn to. No matter how hard she tried, Sophie couldn't break free from the invisible chains that held her in this house. The days were long, and the nights even longer. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much more she could take. Every time she thought things might get better, they would only get worse. And the worst part was that Matthew, the person who was supposed to protect her, was an active participant in her torment. His indifference was worse than any physical abuse. Sophie started to feel like she was losing herself. The girl who had once been hopeful, who had believed that maybe one day she could have a family that cared for her, was slowly being erased. She was becoming invisible, a shadow in a house that was supposed to be a home. But there was one thing Sophie hadn't realized yet. There was still hope. She hadn't reached her breaking point, but it was coming. The tension in the Rivers household had reached a boiling point. Sophie's hope had all but vanished, replaced by a growing sense of dread. Every day felt like a countdown to something even worse. Ethan and Emily had grown bolder in their cruelty, each passing day more merciless than the last. But Sophie had grown used to it. The taunts, the deliberate isolation, the physical pushes and shoves, they had become a part of her life, as normal as breathing. The only thing she hadn't become accustomed to was Matthew's continued indifference. One fateful evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the abuse took an irreversible turn. Sophie had made the mistake of trying to stand up for herself. After days of being humiliated by the twins, she had finally confronted Ethan about the cruel pranks he'd been pulling, stealing her belongings, erasing her homework, making fun of her in front of their friends. For once, Sophie felt a surge of courage, a flicker of defiance she hadn't felt in weeks. She confronted Ethan in the living room, her heart pounding in her chest. But before she could even get the words out, Ethan's expression shifted. His smile, always charming, turned into something dark and sinister. Without warning, he pushed her back into the couch, a brutal shove that knocked the wind out of her. Sophie stumbled, her breath caught in her throat. But before she could stand up, Emily appeared from behind, grabbing her arms tightly. It all happened so quickly. Sophie barely had time to react. Ethan and Emily, working together like they had, countless times before, pushed her into the hallway, their grips tightening as they dragged her toward the stairs. Sophie struggled, but her body felt weak, as if her strength had been drained over the past weeks of relentless torment. They shoved her down the stairs, one after another, until she hit the bottom with a sickening thud. Pain shot through her body, and for a moment, Sophie could barely breathe. She was dazed, her vision blurry from the fall, from the top of the stairs. Matthew watched silently, his eyes cold and distant. He didn't move. He didn't shout at them to stop. He just watched, as though this was some kind of entertainment to him, as though Sophie's pain was nothing more than a passing inconvenience. The house was eerily silent except for Sophie's muffled cries. She tried to push herself up, but the pain was unbearable. The tears that had once been a quiet retreat now flowed freely down her face. Ethan and Emily stood over her, their faces filled with a sense of triumph. They had finally broken her, and they knew it. They laughed, mocking her, as if the violence had been some sort of joke. But the worst part wasn't the laughter. It was the fact that Matthew, the person who had sworn to protect her, stood by and did nothing. Sophie tried to look up at him, hoping for some sign that he cared, some hint of remorse. But all she saw in his eyes was a chilling detachment. He turned away, as if the scene unfolding before him was nothing more than a minor inconvenience to his evening. Sophie lay there, alone, battered and broken, unsure of how much more she could endure. She had always thought that there was some line, some moment when someone would intervene, when someone would stop the madness, but the line never came. Instead, it was as if the abuse had become a part of the fabric of the house, something so ingrained that no one, least of all Matthew, bothered to stop it. In the days that followed, Sophie kept to herself more than ever. She became a ghost in the Rivers house, moving quietly through the rooms, careful not to make a sound that would bring attention to her. Ethan and Emily had what they wanted: control. And Matthew, whether through cruelty or indifference, had given it to them, but Sophie wasn't defeated yet. She had begun to realize something. She might be alone in that house, but she wasn't completely powerless. The night was coming when someone would finally see what had been happening in that house. It wasn't a question of if, but when, as the days dragged on, Sophie's world continued to shrink. The house that once held promise now felt like a prison. Each room was a reminder of the torment she had endured, the empty smiles, the harsh words, the cold indifference. Her body was bruised from the falls, her mind exhausted from the constant mental and emotional abuse. But the worst part wasn't the pain itself. It was the realization that she had no one to turn to. Matthew, her supposed protector, had become nothing more than a silent observer. Ethan and Emily had succeeded in pushing her into a corner, isolating her not only from the outside world, but from any shred of hope that she might escape. Sophie had thought about leaving, running away in the dead of night. But where would she go? The streets? Another foster home? She had been to so many homes already, and none of them had been kind to her. This family, as twisted as it was the closest thing she had to stability. Though, it was the kind of stability that twisted her spirit instead of nurturing it. But even in the darkest moments, a tiny spark of defiance still flickered inside her. Sophie wasn't ready to give up just yet. Then, one afternoon, something shifted. It began with a quiet phone call to the one person Sophie had trusted outside of the Rivers house, a former foster parent who had taken care of her years before. It was a call made in secrecy, a whispered promise of help, though Sophie wasn't sure if she could believe it. But she had to try. She had to make someone believe her. The phone call was brief, just enough for Sophie to explain the situation, the cruelty, the isolation, the indifference of Matthew. The former foster parent, Mrs. Ramirez, listened carefully, asking a few questions, but never interrupting. When Sophie finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sophie held her breath, fearing the worst, that no one would believe her again, that her voice would be silenced just as it always had been. But then, Mrs. Ramirez spoke softly but firmly. "I'll come for you. Just stay strong, Sophie. You're not alone." Sophie hung up the phone, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time in weeks, a tear slid down her cheek, not from pain, but from a small, fragile sense of hope. She had done it. She had reached out, and someone was finally going to listen. That evening, the twins tried their usual routine, mocking her and pushing her boundaries. But Sophie, though exhausted, stood a little taller. She wasn't going to let them break her. Not again. She went to her room, her mind racing with thoughts of escape. She packed a small bag with the few belongings she had left. Nothing valuable, just a change of clothes, and the small diary she had kept hidden under her pillow. She couldn't trust anyone in that house, but she knew that when Mrs. Ramirez came for her, she would be ready. The hours passed slowly, but Sophie didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed, listening for any sign that something was about to change. As the clock struck midnight, there was a faint knock on the front door of the Rivers house. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. It was happening. Mrs. Ramirez had come. The sound of the door opening and voices below reached Sophie's ears. She couldn't hear the words, but she knew what was happening. Someone was finally here to rescue her. Sophie grabbed her bag and tiptoed down the stairs, her pulse racing with excitement and fear. She had no idea how this would play out, but she wasn't going to stay in that house any longer. As she reached the front door, she saw Mrs. Ramirez standing in the doorway, her face filled with concern, but also determination. Without a word, Sophie walked out of the house and into the night. The door closed behind her with a soft thud, and for the first time in a long time, Sophie felt like she could breathe again.